As always, I'll start with a quick eco-park system talk just to set the context and stage a little bit. Quick recap, we are a voluntary park alliance with 9 diverse landowning agencies. They include the Bruce Trail Conservancy, City of Burlington, Conservation Halton, Halton Region, City of Hamilton, Hamilton Conservation Authority, Hamilton Naturalist Club, McMaster University, and last but not least, RBG. We came together as a research project actually in the early 2000s to talk about ways of reconnecting existing protected areas between Hamilton Harbor and Lake Ontario watersheds up to the Niagara Escarpment. The collaboration was officially established in 2013 when those 9 partner agencies came together and decided that we will, as an alliance, work together to protect, restore, and reconnect these natural lands. So we're roughly around Cootes Paradise, heading up to Highway 5 and Waterdown, and then here is Brant Street as a point of reference. And then going down, this is North Aldershot, north of the 400 series highway there. Our decisions are all by consensus, and one thing we're not is a regulatory authority or some sort of separate legal entity or existence. We're really there to fill in the gaps. We're there to make sure our partner agencies are talking to each other and trying to figure out where we can do better work together. Now, the fun thing about this map is there's a lot of light green, which is privately owned outreach areas. What I want to talk about today is sort of that. What folks in and around the eco park system are doing to restore natural areas and steward their properties. Before I hop into that, though, kind of wanted to do a highlight reel of some on-the-ground restoration projects on partner-owned properties that we've been doing to kind of give a picture of what it is that we're doing on the ground. I've talked about research before. I talked about the history of this area, but what does this all look on the ground today? What do Erin and Jeff do on a day-to-day basis? Here's a really good example. It's a Hamilton Conservation Authority property called Canal Park. It's actually a former greenhouse in Dundas. It has been re-landscaped, naturalized, a trail system was put in, a lot of which was done by volunteers. We're kind of looking at this property as the gateway to the eco park system at its western end. If I go back, it's right around here. It's a really, really interesting area. Just a great story of like, I mean, if you look at this picture, there's industry right here, it's baseball diamond and things like that. So it's right in the heart of an urban area. How about Rockcliffe Park? If you're looking at this and seeing a Rona yard, you're right, it is a Rona yard, but it backs onto what used to be a quarry, limestone quarry, up near Highway 5, sort of around the corner of Highway 5 and Highway 6, a place called Clappison Corner. It's being turned into a beautiful space of recovery. Eco Park system partners are working together to bring in more natural green space, even a walking trail. You can kind of see the trail starting along here. There's also a wetland that's been installed. Trails also connect through Waterdown. And again, it's pretty wild to think about that a photo like this is yards away from Arona. And you wouldn't think it's so close to development, which is, I think, pretty neat. For folks who came out to our pop-up booth last week, this might look familiar. It is Kerncliffe Park, also a former quarry. It's an interesting question. What do you do when the economic activity is done in a quarry? One fantastic thing is rehab. It's a great opportunity to rehabilitate a natural area. I think Kerncliffe Park is an excellent example. Here's another angle of what the quarry has turned to. You can see Hamilton, you can see Burlington. It's got a lovely, lovely series of hikes as well. This is probably one of my favorite spots in the eco park system. It's a conservation Halton property called Hopkins Tract. It's in the Pleasant View area. For folks who might remember from the last talk we did, Pleasant View was protected by the work of concerned Dundas citizens who wanted to make sure the space between Cootes Paradise Marsh and the Niagara Escarpment in Dundas remains natural. This particular spot was actually a farm up until 2015, and it's now being revitalized by Conservation Halton. Their goal is to mimic an old forest. If you look closely, you can see these little pits, almost like little bogs and filled with logs as well. And the idea is to give it a sense of old fallen trees, which amphibians just love. It's a breeding hotspot for a variety of different species. Here's another angle. I just kind of like this photo. It's by RBG's head of science, Dr. David Galbraith, on his drive to work in the morning. Little water, or not a waterfall, rainbow. And again, really good angle. You can kind of see why it's called Pleasant View. You can see the horizon of Hamilton just right here. It's pretty great. Focusing more on a more urban area, just a really quick highlight of some work we do. These are called bioswells. Folks who aren't familiar with bioswells, they're probably one of the best ways to manage stormwater in a residential area. This particular one is right across the street from RBG in an area called Brighton Beach in Ancaster. Nope, Aldershot, the other A. It's a really good example of what we try and facilitate and make happen in folks' front yard, essentially. It's pretty exciting. And now I'll turn it off to Erin. I'll hand her the mic for a chat about what folks in the eco park system, around the eco park system, have done and can do to protect natural areas with their backyard or patio or balcony. So Erin, the floor is yours.
Tremendous. Yeah, I'll just wait for me to share my screen and then I'll start my presentation. There we go. Okay, how's that looking? Can everyone see that first slide?
Yep.
Okay, so Tom already mentioned that I work for Conservation Halton. I'll describe a little bit about my role. So they call me a landowner outreach technician. In a nutshell, that means I work with private landowners. So that can be homeowners, it can be business owners, and it can be land managers to do projects that improve water quality and enhance wildlife habitat. So that can mean kind of in any number of things, from large scale creek restoration projects and major tree plantings to what we're here to talk about today, which is like landscape level, like habitat building. Now, Tom had mentioned Hopkins Tract. That's a project that I've been involved in, and like, again, large scale, like 1,000 plus trees being planted and major construction. And I think like, and I'm working on a project up in Waterdown to reconstruct a creek that's been ailing on a City of Hamilton property. But the thing that surprised me most in my short career with Conservation Halton is the impacts that can be made on a very small scale. That'll be including things like like using native plants on your landscape. You could be surprised what will come back to the land, even if it's, again, like a balcony or like a small footprint of a front or backyard. What we have learned and understood over the years of studying native plant species and the pollinators that adapted with them that basically if you build it back, they will find it. But there's a lot and not so much involved in getting to that point. So what I want to do in this talk is to give you some ideas of a direction and guidance of how you might get to a place on your property where you've built in this habitat. So the first thing that I really want to solidify is just embracing what you have. So this is an example of a landowner who moved to a property and after observing it over a spring realized they had quite a bit of water collecting at the back of the property with not really much of a way of getting it off the land. I think traditionally what people might do is build something like a French drain, digging kind of a drain, filling it with aggregate, and then having that move off towards something like another water body like a nearby creek or into the municipal infrastructure. Or alternatives is to bring in a lot of fill just to, kind of build up the area in hopes that that is going to be enough to, so you won't be having saturated soil in those conditions. But in this instance, the landowner said, okay, I've got water in my backyard when we've got heavy rains. I don't want to bring in any extra materials. I don't really feel like just getting it right off the property. So he designed a rain garden. So basically just looking at what your situation is and kind of going with the grain, not necessarily against it. So if you're looking at solutions for your property, it doesn't always have to be like the most effort or a lot of money, and you probably can do it on your own with some guidance or doing your own research. So to start, it's really important to understand what type of soil that you have. Again, you want to understanding what soil you have will dictate what can grow there and then what you would expect from those plants to bring back onto the property. I'm strongly recommending not amending soils unless you're looking for to create a rain garden or to try and solve a problem where you have like really compacted soils or a really dry area. Basically, understanding your soil could be as simple as digging a foot down and just feeling the type of soil. Soil is basically either a mineral or an organic layer. And the mineral layer is basically just it's particle size that's determining what type of soil you have. So you can have anything from like a coarse sand that would be well drained, or even a gravel, and all the way down to a fine silt or a clay, which is like very, very tiny particle size. And that's where you see it very compacted. That's why you use clay for things like making pottery, because it's just such a dense, tightly compact particle that can have, if you have a really dense layer of that, then likely for your permeability of your drainage and that, you're going to see water settling on the surface. So the field test, watching the infiltration rate, even you can do. There are simple, like you could look up on YouTube, simple infiltration tests. It's basically just digging a hole and then sending a certain amount of water and seeing how long it takes for that to drain. Will give you an understanding of the type of soil and the type of drainage you have from that. And like I said, really encouraging not amendments unless you've got extreme circumstances. The other thing too is to avoid overly disturbing your soil. Maybe in a vegetable garden, that might be a bit different because you're probably, weeding a lot more and pulling things out more frequently. But if you're looking at, building in some native plants in a garden, you don't need to till necessarily, maybe just once if you're starting from scratch. But what tilling does is it disturbs your organic soils, and sometimes you can flip them. And in the organic layer and in some of the top of the mineral layer, you have a microbial activity, which is different types of soil bacteria, which are living, and they require, not too, they don't want to be compacted. They don't want to be overly moved and disturbed. They don't want to be exposed to things like fertilizers and chemicals like pesticides, because that really changes that chemistry. And the microbes are what keeps your soil healthy. It helps to prevent things like diseases in the soil that could affect your garden. And overall, it's just a good indication of soil health. So trying to limit the disturbances on the soil and keeping roots in there and leaf material in order for those soil microbes to have something to eat and live off of. So that's, the importance of natural decomposition. And then just generally, once you understand your soil and you understand how to keep it healthy, you just be choosing the right plants for that soil. Things do grow in really dry conditions. They can grow in really wet conditions, and they can grow in like really dense soil like clay. You just need to find the right plant and then have some patience while they settle in. So talking more about like composting. So I'm encouraging to foster and feed those microbes and maybe understand what you might have in your garden. Mulching can be very popular. Can be used for multiple things. I think the two most common reasons why people mulch their garden is to keep weeds out of some of the barren areas in between their plants, and also for aesthetics. I think people like the look of mulch because it's clean and tidy, especially, and some people really like the look of dyed mulches. I would encourage you to look for more like natural mulches if you are buying them from a garden center or getting them from a local garden supply. Get the natural mulch. But the best thing, if you're looking for mulch to keep weeds out, maybe for the short term, but to build back some of that soil health, the best kind is to reach out to a local arborist and ask them if you can get some of their wood chips. It's a bit thicker, but that stuff, it breaks down and it has good microbes and fungi and things that are going to, it's basically just bringing back those nutrients that you're looking for in the soil, and will prevent you from having to amend ever. Also encouraging for like a lot of traditional triple mixes and soil compounds that you can get at your local plant nursery will have peat moss in them. Peat moss, again, it was considered a great amendment because it has the nutrients. It also retains moisture, and it's light, so it has good drainage. The problem with peat is it's harvested from peatlands, and we've learned over the last several decades the importance of peatlands for carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And if we're out there mining the peatlands, we're actually sending that carbon back into, like we're releasing it back into our atmosphere and contributing to climate change. It's also, peatlands are also home to all kinds of really important wildlife, and it's a traditional territories for lots of different First Nations. So really trying to understand the cultural and the habitat significance of peatland. So look for peat-free if you are going that route, and you can always ask stores to sell peat-free products. Alternatively, if you have a yard where you can have a compost, I would really recommend, if you've got leaves on your property, or maybe your neighbor or some friend or family member has leaves on their property that they just want to get rid of, well, I would get your hands on those, because you can create leaf mulch, which is a fantastic, really healthy way to build back nutrients into your soil. And it's basically, if you have leaves on your property, you can do one of two things. You can mulch, like just go over it with your lawnmower, mulch it up just to make it smaller and easier to break down. You can just send that stuff directly on your garden beds, because slowly it will break down. Or you can set it aside in a compost, or even in one of those yard waste bags for like 6 months or so, and it will break down and will start to create this really awesome leaf mold, which is what microbes would feed off of. It's like I've read it, it's like garden gold. So if you can set aside leaves and make your own leaf mold, like you would never have to buy mulch or any type of soil really ever again. The next thing, again, observe, especially if you're, reconsidering like a whole new garden, or you've just moved and you're curious, how you're going to integrate, your new plants onto your property. Just observe. You want to see what the sunlight is doing, where your shady areas are, where your sunny areas are. If you get a bit of both, hills and afternoon sun and all that stuff, just kind of get a sense of what the sunlight, where it's landing, and what time of day. So you can choose your plants according to light. Full sun, they're saying it's direct unfiltered light for more than 6 hours. So that would be most of the day. Part sun shade, between 4 and 6 hours of sun or shade. And anything that has more than 4 hours, less than 4 hours of sun a day, that we consider to be a shady area. Now, the level of shade, when you're looking at plants, if you've got full shade, you probably want to look for plants that are, understory woodland plants that can do really well in those light deprived environments. But you can find them. A shady backyard or shady front yard, you still have lots of options for great plants, both shrubs, trees, and wildflowers. Another thing to consider is, what are you doing with the water on the property? How can you manage stormwater, and how can you conserve it? So again, taking pressure off having to use municipal water or your well water by harvesting the rainwater on your property and directing it where you want it to go, when you want it to go there. So something simple as disconnecting your downspout, adding a rain barrel, or even disconnecting your downspout if you do live in an urban area where it's still connected to the municipal infrastructure. Disconnect that and then and decide, do I just want to extend my downspout onto the lawn or the garden, as long as it's a good 3 meters from your house, or you can experiment with rain barrels. And if you do have extensive stormwater management issues, where you have too much water for your space, or you're in a situation where you have other people's yards draining into your backyard, then you can consider something like a rain garden, or other types of low impact development. Low impact development is kind of a fancy term for basically just green infrastructure, trying to look at solutions, again, kind of going with the grain, looking at what nature traditionally wanted to do, which was to get that water back into the ground. So I'll give you some information. If you do live in the Hamilton Harbor watersheds, so that'd be like Grindstone Creek and some of the urban creeks that drain into Hamilton Harbor. Right now, we do have a grant for landowners who are experiencing issues with stormwater, and the grant is 25. It's a cost share program for us to share 50% up to $2,500 for a low impact development project. So I can get you that information if you're interested. But another thing that you can do is just, again, choosing the right plants. If you've got dry areas on the property, choose drought tolerant plants. If you've got really wet areas on the property, well, you can find plants that are like to be wet most of the time, or at least half the time. So again, you're not out of luck if you have extreme conditions. It's just a matter of finding the right ones that work for that property. Now, you want to choose, taking all that into account. What I find is helpful is just putting a little sketch together, and you can build it up for, like a 10-year plan, or you can just start small and say, these are the areas where I have my sun, I have my shade, this is where my house is, these are where my downspouts are, these are where my paths are, I have existing trees, for example, and then just make a list of, some of the plants that you're interested in for your sunny spots, for your shady spots. Maybe you want to list it by the type of garden you're looking for. I want a garden that's mostly white flowers, or I want a garden that is really tall flowers. So that just having some sort of reference is very helpful. And I guess with having a plan, you don't necessarily have to do everything all at once. You can say, this is my long-term plan. This year, I'm going to plant this many. Give them a couple of years to see how well they do before I plant more of the same. Because I think the mistake we often make is, take all of our budget for the garden or yard, spend it in one season, and then, can be disappointed with varying results as it shapes up over the year. So doing a bit at a time can be quite helpful. And you can choose from different places. You can get from friends who have reputable source of plants, or you can look for like community. Sometimes in your community have like plant swaps and that. So you can try and save money that way. And seeds, because these are all native plants that we're encouraging you to plant, they'll do really well just being sowed directly, even in the fall or winter, because they need that stratification. I'd mentioned, looking at working with what your yard is. If you might find that you have some problems and you need solutions for them. So things like I'd already mentioned, using rain barrels to try and get water off the property, mulching if you're trying to build back some of your soil. You can use compost, you can use arborist mulch, and kind of just let that organic soil build back up. And if you're really looking for, you're having problems with turf growing, there is alternatives. Microclover seems to be something that's catching on, that people just seed into their lawns if they're not doing well. So it's creating the look of lawn. It requires less mowing because it grows really short, and it flowers. So then you get the added benefit of it being great fodder for like small bees and butterflies and whatnot. So there are, you have chances to right wrongs in, again, going with the grain and not having to tear out your entire lawn and start from scratch. You can just say, this is what I'm working with. What are solutions that have worked for other people? And then I guess finally, you want to think about what type of garden you want to look like. You can have, I think often people are put off by the idea of having a native plant garden or a naturalized garden, because they think it's going to look like this, which to some people is what their desired effect is just to have sort of a meadow look. But you can have a conventional looking garden where things are kind of separate with paths, and that it's really anything's possible. It's just a matter of planning and looking for the right plants and waiting for that specific type of look that you want for that area. The meadow type gardens, in my experience, requires less upkeep because they do really create this dense area where there's no weeds. You don't need to mulch. You won't need to water unless there's a drought. And it's basically, you can create paths so you can walk through it, or you can mow depending on the size of the property. But like I said, it's not the only type of garden that you'll have if you're planting with native plants. Probably the most important thing is to choose plants based on their height and spread, kind of know what sight lines you want to have and how big things are going to get. You might get a plant that's little to start, but it might grow quite a bit over a few years. So just really have in mind what the end game is for the growth of those plants. Another thing to consider, I did talk earlier a little bit about LID. So this is a picture of what we would call a permeable driveway. So the idea was this landowner would have water collect on their driveway, and then it could turn to ice, or it'd be just problematic for having pooling and ponding. The added benefit of having a permeable driveway is you can send your downspout directly into it, and then you're actually taking the pressure off the municipal system by getting that water into the ground. This driveway is a simple design. Basically, the landowner hired a contractor to dig about 1.5 to 2 feet down, and then fill it with a angular stone, so it creates a permeable space for the water volume, and then put the bricks down, and then fill the bricks with a permeable angular granite for that nice look. The other thing that I would encourage is when you're bringing materials into the garden, especially, is to find things that are reused, recycled, and things that will break down over time, so you're not having to like send stuff to the landfill. And then I guess the other thing I would encourage is finding things locally, either from, like, if you're getting things used, you can get it from, you know, maybe some, like, keep an eye out for things on Kijiji or on within your neighborhood. And if you're buying materials, you know, try and find them at your local garden center or local plant, nursery. I'd say probably the take-home message when you start to plant your trees is to plant the diversity. Diversity is what is going to, the more diverse plants that you put in there, you're basically building a whole ecosystem. So if you just have one type of plant and you had, say, like bad weather conditions, or you had a pest come in, you might lose that plant, or it'd be a lot of effort to keep it going. But if you plant like 15 or 20, then you won't necessarily be so concerned about the health of just one plant every year. You can enjoy things as they come up. Here's an example of a few different types of plants that we've got. Let's see, I believe that's foam flower, perhaps. There's a vervain and the goldenrod. Goldenrod's got a bad rap this time of year because they happen to be flowering at the same time as ragweed, but they are not, they're not a huge culprit, or if any culprit for creating allergies. So they're fine to have them in your garden. But the nice thing is you want to choose the variety of plants that have different bloom times, especially if you're trying, you know, if you're trying to build back habitat for different types of insects. They need to eat all through the growing season. So you have something come up like April and then extend it all the way out until late November, December. Things like goldenrods and asters would be an example of that. Picking different flower shapes, different colors, color blocking. So you can plant in clumps. So you have like a big yellow spot, and that will attract plants as opposed to just having like one of each. Planting in layers and of different heights, depths, and tiers is really important. Again, you're creating this like self-sustaining ecosystem. So you're bringing in lots of different types of insects that can kind of control the population within it. Like I had mentioned, anticipate how the heights and the spreading of things when you're before you're planting them, so you know you're not planting something in the wrong spot. Considering other ways to create habitat, just leaving a few bare areas is going to be great for the local solitary bees. Here's an example of how bees, they'll dig a hole. You can see this with, if you've ever seen a carpenter bee at work, all they're doing is just creating a hole so that they can lay their eggs, their larvae for that will emerge in the spring. So you can leave the ground bare if you're not keen on that. When you can just get some hollow sticks and just leave them out in the garden and keep them out there till well into early summer, so that you can see if those bees have emerged. You'll see, I don't really see them on this picture, but oh yeah, there's one there. The bees will, once they're finished laying their eggs, they'll cover the hole just to protect the larvae in there. Just some example of, if you want to attract birds and insects to your property, think of things like shrubs or trees with berries. A good couple that grow really well in this area are elderberry. They like it. They can like it a little bit wet and shady. Service berries don't mind shade, but they can also take sun. They both flower. Service berries flower earlier. They have nice white flowers, which turn into berries later in the summer. Elderberries a bit later in the summer, but same thing. They have white flowers that turn into berries. Dogwoods are great. They're pretty forgiving. They like most soil conditions. Some really like it wet too, so you can get away with them in wetter areas. if you're bringing insects on, if you're promoting habitat for insects, that's where you're going to see the birds coming into, because they eat the insects. Same with some smaller mammals or amphibians or reptiles. If you're into that, insects eat native plants, and then the birds eat the insects off the plants. If you have plants that aren't getting eaten, I would consider that kind of a fail. I like to see a little bit of holes, in the trees and shrubs or the wildflowers. That actually makes me feel good. And the best thing is seeds. Some of our birds, especially when all our flowers have gone to seed, that's a big source of their nutrients later in the season. Shrubs, often shrubs are a plant that we might not think about. Sometimes we want gardens that are just wildflowers, or we already have existing trees, but think about bringing back some shrubs, setting aside some areas for different types of shrubs. Evergreens are really important overwintering. You may not be able to have one in your yard, but see if there's one in your neighborhood. And if there isn't, maybe advocate, especially for like your city or some park or something in the neighborhood, to be able to build back some of that habitat. Don't see too many. There's so many different, diverse, amazing native shrubs, and I don't see them a lot in urban areas, which would be great to start seeing those being built back over time. Like I said, they provide nesting area for birds and provide food for insects, butterflies and birds. And I guess one of the last things I want to touch on is the importance of overwintering habitat. A lot of people feel the need to clean up their yards this time of year, when things look dead and maybe aren't so appealing. But I would give you two suggestions: either resist doing your fall cleanup at all, or if you are, if you like that tidy look, cut your flowers off, and if they're hollow stems, leave them about 12 inches, because that's where you're going to get your solitary bees to be able to use that habitat. And then for any of those flowers, maybe bundle them or leave them somewhere in the yard so that the birds can eat them. You don't necessarily have to keep them upright stalks, but if you can just keep them on the property, because they're great for the birds. Like, you can put up bird feeders. A lot of people do in the winter. That's fine, but birds being able to find their own seeds for forage is great, because it's more predictable and it's less work for us to have to keep filling the feeders for them. Yeah, so it concludes my talk, and it was quite a bit in a short period of time, but I have given some resources over to Tom and Chelsea that we can share. And here's my email. If you have burning questions, by all means, reach out to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, well, thanks to the C2E crew for having me here today. I'm Jeff Stock with the Hamilton Conservation Authority's Watershed Stewardship Program. I'm happy to chat with you about getting your Ecosize, the benefits to managing invasive plants at home and your community. So first things first, what exactly is an invasive species, you might be asking? Well, according to the Government of Canada, invasive species are plants, animals, and microorganisms introduced by human activity outside their natural past, present, or current distribution, whose introduction or spread threatens the environment, the economy, society, and that includes human health. So starting with the word invasive, well, you have trouble. The root of invasive comes from the word invade, and that's exactly what they do. Invasive species, introduced or alien species, as they're often called, or non-native species that invade and disrupt ecosystems that they colonize. So they pose a threat to biodiversity by outpacing native species, either by growing and spreading at what can be alarming rates, or by outcompeting habitats and food sources. So according to the World Conservation Union, invasive alien species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. In their new ecosystems, invasive alien species become predators, competitors, parasites, hybridizers, and even diseases of our native domesticated plants and animals. It can take the right conditions for an alien species to become established and grow, though. In fact, most alien introduced species don't actually become permanently established in their newly found environment. They either find the wrong type of conditions for survival, or they're unable to produce enough offspring to maintain a viable population. And for those species that are able to reproduce and survive, most never actually cause any significant problems. Some introduced species, however, are able to thrive and even flourish at their new location. So in addition, they're usually able to reproduce and spread very quickly, often outcompeting native plant and animal species for water, food, and space. Invasive alien species generally share common characteristics which can make them difficult to control and maintain. And that can include higher rates of reproduction, fewer natural predators, and the ability to thrive in different types of environments. So the impact of invasive species on native ecosystems, habitats, and species is pretty severe and can be difficult to reverse, oftentimes. Costing a fair bit of money over the years. And so how do they get around exactly? Well, people are the primary spreaders. They're primarily spread by human activities. So when the goods that we use, traveling around the world very quickly, sometimes we're unknowingly carrying species as we go. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing specifically on invasive plant species. So further to the question of invasive species, what is Ecosize, and what does that have to do with invasive species? So Ecosize was an initiative that was developed as a way to engage the public in a meaningful way in the field of stewardship at Hamilton Conservation Authority. I'm always looking for ways to engage and mobilize the public to do their part to mitigate the effects of invasive species in natural areas. So, pulling, digging, lopping, uprooting, those types of things. Tree plantings and garbage pickups can often be easier sells because on the surface it's kind of cut and dry, whereas the removal of invasive species isn't always so easy. So years ago, when we started hosting a few invasive species polls, people would remark how great it made them feel afterwards, something to the effect of getting a good workout. I guess it could be somewhat akin, depending on what species you're removing, to kind of like high intensity gardening. And a light bulb went off in my head. I thought, maybe this is an opportunity to pitch invasive species removal as a way to get exercise, and hence Ecosize was born. So we launched the initiative back in 2019. As you can see in these images here, the woman on the left has a pretty substantial amount of invasive species in her backyard, on her literal doorstep. On the flip side, you have an individual who's working towards having pulled out some invasive plants in this natural area here. So the idea was that getting people engaged, getting people involved, and getting involved in nature in a meaningful way. So what does Ecosize exactly get you? Wow. A more resilient landscape and a more active and resilient you. So we've hosted a number of successful events to remove invasive species on both private lands and on Hamilton Conservation Authority owned conservation areas in the watershed. We received some funding actually in 2020 thanks to a Hamilton Conservation Foundation grant, and we've been expanding those events over time. So some of the species we've targeted: Japanese knotweed, multifloor rose, honeysuckle, English ivy, privet, buckthorn, Japanese barberry, English ivy, privet, the list goes on. So the motto that we have for Ecosize is get active out in nature, do some good for the environment while you're at it. I think that's a pretty good summation of what we're trying to do. Building something meaningful in the endeavor of invasive species removal, and something I hope you can relate to and gravitate towards doing, maybe whether it's on your property, maybe on an apartment complex, or in your shared space. So invasive species do have a variety of environments in which they thrive, and you're likely to find one right on your doorstep. You'll find them everywhere, from popping up in some of the most pristine places that you never expect, all the way to cracking through the concrete, maybe in your backyard unexpectedly. So in the effort to get Ecosize, there are quite a few benefits that you can appreciate while you're pulling invasive plants from time to time. So I generated a list here. First one, exercise, obviously. Getting outside usually involves some level of exercise, even if it's just taking a walk in your neighborhood, getting an idea of the makeup of the plants in your immediate neighborhood area. So even like 15 to 30 minutes of exercise each day can have some pretty long-term benefits to your mind and body, and decreases your risk of diseases like diabetes, heart disease, arthritis. And working on an invasive species pull is usually having us working at a dedicated site for around 2 hours, or whatever pace that works for the individual. So again, like I said, real high intensity gardening. Stress relief. Studies show that being in nature reduces tension and depression. A study done in South Korea showed that looking at pictures of natural settings can even increase a person's general mood and positivity and emotional stability, which is fantastic. So you can imagine working in an environment where you're immersed in greenery is going to have a pretty measurable effect on your mood. Vitamin D. So vitamin D has a wide range of health benefits. It can boost our immune systems. 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight a day for our bodies can help produce the proper levels of vitamin D. So getting outside and treating yourself to some vitamin D is really critical. You can imagine 2 hours of pulling invasive plants is going to have a pretty dramatic effect on your vitamin D levels. Sleep. Oops. So working out in nature can really increase your sleep quality. So this is partly due to stress reduction, and also because exposure to sunlight during the day can increase your melatonin production at night. And melatonin is needed to regulate your sleep cycle. So you're better off to sleep knowing you've done a job well done after a good day of Ecosize on a cool, crisp fall day. And eyesight. So much time behind a screen, too much time can really take a toll on one's eyesight. Spending some time outdoors gives your eyes an opportunity to focus on objects far away, near and far, and can help reduce eye strain. So working in a variable environment is really going to go a long way to help keeping your eyesight healthy. Researchers in the United States and Germany actually found that that being in nature actually helps improve creativity. So the study showed that even looking at the color green for a few seconds triggered greater creativity than others. And maybe if you develop some new and innovative ways of removing invasive species while, being out in nature, please let me know. We're always looking for new and innovative ways to tackle the myriad of invasive plants we're managing. And finally, relationships. So we do spend a lot of time in front of screens. So getting out in nature, really a great way to reconnect with people, meeting some new faces, getting involved in Ecosize events. You're likely to meet some like-minded individuals who are interested in local ecology, environmental health, sustainability, and you might even make some new connections or even some friendships. So I've hopefully sold you on the idea of getting on board for your Ecosize and decided to tackle invasive species on your property. So where to start? Start small. Develop a plan for your property that you're working on, the landscape in question. This could involve drawing a map of the space you have or building a list of invasive species on the property that are present. And once you've done that work, you can start building a master plan for your course of action. Are you going to focus on one species at a time? Are you going to work your way from the eastern edge of the property to the western edge of the property? Or are you going to go full tilt, get a couple dozen of your friends and just have a major invasive species blitz? Whatever works for you, that's what's most important. So just remember to keep it manageable, start small, and be realistic so you don't overwhelm yourself, and you can grow from there. So I'd also add that it's important to keep in mind that you target the root causes of invasive species and not just the symptoms. So if you find yourself pulling dozens and dozens of little saplings year after year, and they keep popping back to no avail, maybe you might want to take a step back and find out where those saplings are coming from. There may be a parent tree that will save a lot of your future self from some extra hard work. And as the old saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which I think catches it. And don't forget to stretch. So whatever you end up doing, make sure you've given yourself a little bit of time to get ready for whatever invasive species you're dealing with. So it might require a fair bit of repetitive action, and a little bit of stretching beforehand could save you a lot of aches and pains after the fact if you prepared yourself for an afternoon's field work. So I pulled together just a very small handful of some of the common invasive species that you might run into. So common buckthorn, also known as Rhamnus cathartica. So this is a pretty common invasive shrub found in our watersheds. It's a pretty hardy tree, shade, drought tolerant, comes in a wide range of habitats. One of the big issues is that the berries that they produce it's a prolifically producing fruit tree, and unfortunately acts as a diuretic for birds that eat it. So it gets spread pretty quickly, and unfortunately it doesn't have any natural predators to maintain it, so it can take over an environment pretty quickly. Excuse me. Another pretty prolific species, Multifloor Rose. So it's a multi-stemmed woody perennial shrub. You'll find it kind of in sunny outcroppings where roadsides, opportunities for it to flourish. Again, there are no natural predators to keep it in check. So it will flourish in the understory and really outcompete pretty effectively many of our native species. I don't know if you can see my arms here. No, not really, but it's pretty nasty too. We were working in a big field of it this afternoon, and boy, does it smart. And finally, Japanese knotweed. So this is one of our worst offenders in the invasive species field that we're trying to combat. So semi-woody stemmed perennial, not too dissimilar looking to bamboo actually. It was originally planted for erosion control, and has unfortunately escaped. Oftentimes you'll find it getting transported in fill projects. So be wary if you're planning to have a portion of your property regraded. Make sure that it's certified clean fill. A lot of this stuff gets spread in contaminated fill, and nothing short of excavation or short of that, really, you're going to be spending 10 years of digging, herbicides. It's a nasty one. So on that note, it's really important to know what tools, the effective tools that you're going to want to be using for the invasive species that you're working on, and knowing how to use them effectively. So there's a variety of helpful tools when it comes to mechanical control. When you're being active, everything from pruners, loppers, shovels, trowels, even the orange tools you can see in the image here are called extractigators, which are a very handy tool for pulling up the roots of invasive, moderately sized shrubs, kind of like the buckthorn that you saw earlier. Very effective tool, and something you'll likely see if you ever end up coming to one of our Ecosize events. So, sometimes it's hard to admit we cannot take every magnitude of invasive species on alone. And I think it's important to know when to rely on other individuals, organizations that might be able to help you and assist you in the task. So here's a few items in when to take a second look and decide whether maybe you might need to step back. So species type and invasiveness. So there are some species that just won't quit, like the Japanese knotweed you saw earlier. And it's important to know that you may need to put in a significant amount of time and effort to really successfully eradicate an invasive species from an effort. Sometimes this is going to take 5 to 7 years, depending on the species, to really wear it out from the seed bank, perhaps. Perhaps it's the timing of when you're removing the species, which can be really time and labor consuming, and really knowing to which helpful resources there are available. Certainly relying upon your trusty neighborhood stewardship technician with a conservation authority can help. The magnitude of invasion. So for those who have large swaths of land in which they own and tend to, you may find that there may be a period of time where, an invasion is spread so wide that, you're just not going to be able to handle it alone, that you just can't keep up with its spread. And finally, just some manual techniques, unfortunately, the invasive species won't take to these conventional methods of removal, like digging, like using some of the tools shown earlier. They could be too deep in the soil, spread too far afield, or any small fragment left in the soil isn't going to allow it to regenerate, and it can be quite frustrating sometimes. So that takes me to the next slide. Additional options. So if you've done enough research on the invasive species that are inhabiting your property, you may find that there are some notoriously aggressive species that you're just going to find it possible to eradicate on your own by traditional methods. So this is a good time to identify when taking it on alone may be too much, and when to call for help. So your respective representative conservation authority is going to be able to help you not only on large scale invasions. We can also help you find the right contractor if it's going to require possibly a herbicide treatment. And our conservation authorities also offer a grant program for tackling some of the more aggressive and difficult to defeat invasive species in the watersheds. And of course, we're here to help you with developing a management plan and hopefully an eradication plan that suits the needs of your property. So bridging other gaps that maybe there just may be need to build capacity in your own community. Building capacity between neighbors is a great way to get ahead of the game. So maybe there's a local environmental group that's operating in your neighborhood that could be helpful. Social media can play a huge part in bringing people together for common causes, whether it's identifying, particular invasive species locally or throughout Ontario. There's also great master gardening groups out there that can be an invaluable resource. So you may even find yourself taking the lead on something. Maybe you need to be the one that takes charge and starts knocking on doors of neighbors. Unfortunately, invasive species don't always respect borders. Often they don't. An invasive species on a neighbor's property is likely going to become an invasive species issue on your property. It's important to get in touch with your neighbors and get that conversation going. So here's an example I wanted to share where a landowner was able to build their capacity and make some headway beyond their property alone. So the landowner in the image here, number one, got in touch with conservation stewardship staff and enlisted an Ecosize volunteer event to remove some of the invasive species on their property. They'd been working hard to manage invasive species on their property, but just didn't have the people power to do so. So we ended up having a phenomenal invasive species removal that day. And what happened was connections were made with neighbors, word spread between number 2 and 3, that there were opportunities to work with the Conservation Authority to help them with their own particular invasive species issues, similar to what number 1 was sharing. And we built onto that with number 4, which is actually Hamilton Conservation Authority lands. So building upon what the landowners had been doing and really growing that area where we're really trying to get invasive species under control in quite a wide area, and keeps growing. And coincidentally enough, number 5 is actually a staff member with the Conservation Authority. So that is another connection that we're going to be making soon, and further spreading that knockdown of invasive species in the area and restoring biodiversity. So just a few more resources that are available to you that you can find online. So there's the Ontario Invading Species Program. They have a program that delivers a number of initiatives that promote public engagement about invasive species awareness and prevention across the province. There's the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. They're a not-for-profit organization that provides leadership, expertise, and forums to engage and empower Ontarians to take action on their invasive species issues. And I would highly recommend you go check out their page. They have phenomenal resources available to help not only identify, but manage and eradicate a great deal of the invasive species that we're dealing with in our respective watersheds. Further to that, iNaturalist, which is an app that you can use. It's a crowdsourced species identification system. You can either use it on your computer or, better yet, on your smartphone. It helps you identify species that you may encounter on your property. And better yet, the information used is shared between organizations that track invasive species spread, not only across Ontario and even North America, which is fantastic. And finally, the Hamilton Conservation Authority has a list of videos. We were lucky enough to hire on a couple of phenomenal invasive species technicians earlier this year and they've taken it upon themselves to create some videos, how-to videos. As you can see in the image here, how to smother invasive ground cover. They've got several more, and there are more to come. So I highly recommend you check out the Hamilton Conservation webpage for that. So if you're interested, maybe you want to get your, before taking on a major task yourself, maybe you want to get involved in a volunteer Ecosize event that we're going to be hosting this fall. You can go to our webpage here and register as a volunteer, conservationhamilton.ca/volunteer opportunity. So we do have a handful of volunteer Ecosize events coming up. You can meet our volunteer stewardship and invasive species techs. And you can learn a heck of a lot about invasive species that we're managing, and you might be able to put 2 and 2 together with maybe some species you're dealing with yourself. And finally, here's my contact information. So if you have any questions, or if you're in the Hamilton Conservation Watershed and want to get in touch, by all means, send me an email, or you can give me a call. And that's everything for me. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeff. I really like your last point. We can sit and listen to presentations all day, but getting out is really, really helpful to put some of this in practice and really see it in person. So if you're feeling encouraged, inspired, definitely reach out for volunteer opportunities.